Hello guys, I welcome you all for the 5 editorials of the week series. So in this initiative, we will be identifying the 5 important editorials which are most relevant for the mains preparation, which came in the Hindu in the last 1 week, and we will be discussing those editorials in the details. And today I have identified another 5 editorials. Let us discuss those now. The first editorial is about the India's need for the fiscal council. So in this editorial, they are talking whether India needs a fiscal council or not to manage this fiscal discipline. In the second editorial is about the direct tax reforms and the problems with respect to direct tax collection. The third one is about the agricultural marketing reforms, and the fourth one is about the global governance of the space. So how we have to regulate the space sector, and it is written by Mr. Syed Akbaruddin. And the last one is from Indian Express for a change today. So it is about the global university rankings and why Indian universities are not going into the global top 100. So let us go and discuss the today's videos. So the first editorial for the day is India does need a fiscal council. So this editorial is written by Mr. Govinda Rao. Govinda Rao is a financial expert. He was the member of the 14th Finance Commission, and he was also the former director of National Institute of Public Finance and Policy. So a great financial expert with respect to the public finance is writing the article. So it is as much relevant for our preparation. We are having this word called government budgeting in the syllabus. The meaning for the word fiscal is budgeting or government finances. So, and hence it is directly related to the GS paper 3 economy, and hence this article is very important for our preparation. So in this article, the author argues for the necessity of the fiscal council. He says that fiscal council is mandatory. So why fiscal council is mandatory? So before understanding that, let us understand the meaning for the word fiscal. Fiscal means anything which is related to government finances or government budgeting. So what does the government budgeting consists of? Government budgeting consists of receipts. So receipts or revenue at one side. This comes in the form of taxes or non-taxes. By getting the receipts or revenue from the people, it is doing the expenditure for the welfare of the people. So it is gaining the receipts, that is the income for the government, and doing the expenditure. So whenever the expenditure of the government is greater than the receipts, what happens? There is a deficit, which means that government is spending more than what it earns. So deficit is nothing but when expenditure is more than receipts. So that is expenditure minus receipts. So that is the deficit. So the meaning for the word fiscal deficit is the total deficit in the budget. That is total borrowing. So deficit is nothing but the excess of money that government is spending over and above its revenue, which means that it needs to borrow that money. So it is not having enough money to do the expenditure, so it is going to borrow that deficit whichever is needed. So fiscal deficit is nothing but the total borrowings of the governments. In order to finance the deficit, government is going to borrow the money. So fiscal deficit is nothing but the total borrowings of the government, which government is going to borrow for doing the expenditure. Now let us come back to the fiscal council. Why there is a necessity for fiscal council? The fiscal council is a independent body which is going to advise the government or Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance is responsible for making the budget, and it handles the entire fiscal accounting. So this fiscal council is going to advise and give recommendation to Ministry of Finance with respect to the fiscal discipline. With respect to the fiscal discipline and management. In 2003, in order to bring in the fiscal deficit, government passed the Fiscal Responsibility and Budget Management Act. So this act was passed in 2003 in order to bring the fiscal discipline. So this act provided a legal provision, and it gave the legally binding target. So it provided legally binding target for fiscal deficit. That is, government should always maintain the fiscal deficit at 3% of GDP. So that was the target given by this FRBM Act. Even though the government has given a legally binding target with respect to the fiscal deficit, and government even after 17 years hasn't achieved this 3% target. Even the 2018 we achieved 3.4. In 2019, the government's official estimate was to be 3.8. So still we are in 3.8 only. We are not achieving the target. The fiscal deficit is growing over the years. The debt of the government is growing over the years. And there is a fall in the transparency and accountability with respect to the government budgeting. So government is not accountable in most of the cases with respect to the budget. So that is another very big problem. In the recent times, government is being dependent on the off the budget financing. So what is this off the budget financing? Apart from getting the finances from the revenue through taxation, government is getting the revenue from sources which is off the budget. So sources which is off the budget means it is making other arrangement to get the money. So if government is dependent on off the budget target, then it will not be responsible for the parliament, because only the taxpayers money, with respect to taxpayers money from the consolidated fund of India, it is responsible to the parliament. So many of the budget revenues, like arranging special banking arrangement for covering the arrears of fiscal fertilizer subsidy, or issuing the short term bonds, or borrowing from the national small savings fund, if that is the case, the transparency and accountability of the government finance is at question mark, and that's why we need a fiscal council, an independent fiscal council, to check the government with respect to the fiscal discipline. The author is starting by mentioning that the fiscal deficit target for the year 2019-20 was set at 3.8, but it exceeded and reached at 4.6. So in 2019-20, the target set by the FRBM Act is 3. Government estimated was 3.8, but it ended up at 4.6, which is very huge with respect to the target, almost 1.6 points higher than the target. And see, because of the COVID-19 crisis, what is happening? At one side, there is a fall in the government revenues. Since a lot of people have lost the jobs, since there is a fall in profits, number of people who are paying taxes is falling. So tax revenue for the government is falling at one side. On another side, there is a demand for increased expenditure. So I have already made a video for why government should increase the expenditure in order to revive the economy and in order to boost the economy from the slowdown. You see that video, you will understand why government is in the demand for increasing the expenditure. At one side, revenue is falling. At the other side, expenditure is going to increase. Revenue will be falling and expenditure is going to increase. So deficit value is also going to increase. If this is the case, now government should resort to borrowing. வருமானமும் இல்லை, செலவு அதிகமாக போகுது, ஸோ கடன் தான் வாங்கணும். ஸோ இட் இஸ் கோயிங் டு ரிசார்ட் டு பாரோயிங். ஸோ பாரோயிங் இஸ் கோயிங் டு இன்க்ரீஸ். சின்ஸ் த பாரோயிங் இஸ் கோயிங் டு இன்க்ரீஸ், the debt to GDP ratio, which is already at 69% presently, might reach 85%. And the fiscal deficit, since we are going to borrow more, fiscal deficit is nothing but total borrowing, it has to be maintained at 6%. According to FRBM Act, it has to be maintained at 6%. That is 3% by the union government and 3% by all the state governments put together. But now union governments itself, it's going to reach 7%, and state governments fiscal deficit will reach 5%. So total fiscal deficit, instead of staying at 6%, it will be 12%. So all the targets are shooting up and government finances are out of control. At this juncture, we need a fiscal council to manage all. So that is the arguments of the author. So the necessity of the fiscal council is already being recommended by 13th Finance Commission and 14th Finance Commission, and recently formed FRBM committee under the chairmanship of N.K. Singh also recommended a fiscal council. The N.K. Singh committee recommended that a fiscal council with a chairperson and 2 members should be formed. It should be independent with a non-renewable term of 4 years for the chairperson. And the role of the council will be to prepare the fiscal forecast. That is what will be the forecast for fiscal deficit, forecast for revenue, forecast for expenditure. See, only if government knows what is the forecast for the revenue for the present year, then only it can plan for the expenditure. இந்த வருஷம் எவ்வளவு வருமானம் வரப்போகுதுன்னு தெரிஞ்சாதான் எவ்வளவு செலவு பண்ணணும்னு புரியும். So only if it knows the revenue for present year, it can plan for the expenditure. So it should have accurate value for the revenue forecast. It should have accurate value for the expenditure forecast. So forecasting should be a professional job. So professionals should be involved, and that's why a fiscal council was recommended to be having the professionals who are going to prepare this multi-year fiscal forecast, and they are going to recommend the fiscal strategy. So what is the fiscal strategy? The fiscal strategy for the government is going to be to always going to increase the revenue. The government should aim at increasing the revenue and rationalize the expenditure. So this is going to be the fiscal strategy. So how to rationalize expenditure and how to increase the revenue, that will be advised by this particular council. And improving in the quality of the fiscal data. So the data collected should be of good quality, and whenever the government is not able to maintain target, this fiscal council will recommend the strategy for maintaining the target. So this is going to be the role of the fiscal council as recommended by the FRBM review committee. In general, by comparing the fiscal councils working all over the world, the common characteristics of fiscal council is described in this article. So if there is a question regarding the government budgeting and how the government's fiscal deficit should be ensured, we can write in our answers that a fiscal council should be formed with following characteristics. It should be an independent entity. Independent entity means it should not be working under government, or it should not be those members should not be appointed directly by the government, or the member should not be a government servant. So it should be independent, like Election Commission or UPSC. It should be an independent body. aimed at promoting stable and sustainable public finance. It should be non-partisan. So non-partisan means the people belonging to that should not be working in favor of any party. So they should be non-partisan and they should be professional. They should be professionals like the author himself, who is Govind Rao. So like professionals like him should be the members of this council, who are going to advise and provide oversight to the government with respect to fiscal discipline, and at the same time they will be doing the scientific analysis of the government budget and government's finances. Only if there is a scientific analysis for the government finances, we can have quality data, we can have quality forecast. If such kind of a quality data and forecast or strategy is given, it can be reported, it can be presented to parliament. So one important characteristics of fiscal council should be that it should be independent body. It should not be working under government. If not working under government, then under whom it should work? It should work under parliament. It should be working under parliament, like comptroller and auditor general. Like how CAG is directly responsible to parliament, this fiscal council also should be directly responsible to parliament, and it should be answerable to parliament. It should be the conscience keeper, like how the CAG is the conscience keeper of the government purse. It should be the conscience keeper with respect to the government's fiscal management. Okay, based on the reports of this fiscal council, the debates in the parliament will improve and we can scrutinize the government in a more better way. So role of the parliament is to scrutinize the executives. That is the role of the parliament. So executives can be scrutinized well. If this fiscal council is formed, that will augment the role of the CAG. Okay, it should also analyze the costs. Analyzing the cost means if at all government is announcing any populist move. Populist move means government's policies which are announced with the election in mind or vote bank politics in mind, without considering the rationality, financial rationality. That is farm loan waiver. Farm loan waiver is a bad step with respect to economics. Likewise, providing the freebies. So all those things, government, if at all government is announcing any populist move, it should analyze the costs. Okay, people will be expecting welfare from the government. So there should be a clear line between the welfare moves and populist moves. So this fiscal council should create awareness among the people on the difference between the what is a move which is aimed at welfare and what is a move which is populist. Just by announcing the farm loan waiver, it is not going to help the agriculture in the long term. Okay, so making structural changes in the agriculture is a welfare move, but announcing a farm loan waiver is a populist move, which is going to be very bad with respect to finances. It should create public awareness to differentiate between the welfare moves and the populist move. That should be the another target, and it should have a transparent working mechanism. Okay, the entire working of the fiscal council should be transparent. Like already government formed a monetary policy committee. Similarly, we were facing challenges with respect to monetary policy in controlling inflation. Government formed a monetary policy committee with 6 members, with 3 from RBI and 3 from government's representation. And this monetary policy committee successfully contained the inflation between 2 to 6%. And with similar to monetary policy committee, a fiscal council should be formed, which is independent and non-partisan with professionals. So that is what the author is arguing. 36 countries all over the world are having this fiscal council, who have successfully stabilized the public finances. That is, the best fiscal councils are Belgium model, Chile model and UK model. All the such bodies in 36 countries, and analyzing the working of that fiscal council in 36 countries has shown that wherever such a body is being formed, the public balances, that is the balance sheet of the government, has attained a stability. There has been stable public balances with and accurate forecasts. Whatever the forecast given by this council has been very accurate, and that has helped in policy making. Only if the weather forecast is good, then only government can plan for the any cyclone or flood. Similarly, there should be accurate forecast with respect to fiscal data, then only we can plan the and budget, do the proper budgeting. So that is the logic here. So, and hence we need to form a fiscal council. And finally, what the author is telling is that FRBM Act was passed in 2003. It was passed in 2003, and after 17 years of existence, even though it didn't revolutionize the government budgeting, at least it has brought little amount of fiscal discipline with the government. It has created at least little change with respect to the fiscal management. Similarly, this creation of fiscal council is not a silver bullet to improve the fiscal discipline of the government. It is not going to revolutionize anything, but for sure, like FRBM Act, it will improve the functioning of the government budgeting. It will improve the efficiency of the government budgeting for sure, and that's why it is needed to complement the rule-based FRBM framework. Only if there is a body, see, we are having this FRBM framework, but only if we have a fiscal council kind of a body, we can ensure that it is being implemented in a better way with the proper checks and balance in fiscal field. Okay, so we need to create these checks and balances, and entire budget making cannot be in the hand of Ministry of Finance alone. So that should be a proper checks and balance. So the second editorial for the day is about the catching the elusive taxpayers. So this article is written by Mr. Arun Kumar. Mr. Arun Kumar is a renowned economist in India, and he also is an expert with respect to corruption. He has written a lot of books with respect to corruption, and he is a renowned economist. So he is talking about the India's tax collections. So this article deals with the tax collection of India. In syllabus, we are having this word called mobilization of resources. So the meaning for the word mobilization of resources means various methods taken by the government or strategies by the government to improve the government resources or to boost the government revenues. So here, since it is direct, since this word is directly in there in syllabus, this article is very much relevant for our preparation. So in this article, the author argues that even after government has taken various steps with respect to improving the direct tax collection, that is income tax and corporate tax, none of the step is working. Over the period of time, for the past 10 years, none of the step is working, and the government's income tax collection is almost stagnant. It is not at all improving. So in India, out of 1.3 billion taxpayers, 15 million, that is 15 lakhs people pay tax. So which is almost 1.11% of total population. The number of people paying tax is almost stagnant for the past decade, and the tax to GDP ratio, that is the amount of direct tax collected to total GDP, is stagnant at 5.5%. Whatever measures government is taking is not working at all. So that is the biggest problem with respect to India's tax election. So note this data. Such data can be mentioned while writing the answer. So these kind of data are very precious. If you could see India's economic disparity, 10% of the Indians are earning 55% of nation's income. So if India earns 100 rupees, 10% of the people are earning the 55 rupees of it. So 10% of the rich people are earning 55% of the national income, and the rest of the 90% of the population are earning only 45% of the income, which is a huge economic disparity which needs to be corrected. If all this 55% of the income is taxed properly, then our tax to GDP ratio will be increasing to 18%. So the direct tax to GDP ratio, without accounting the black money, it will be at 18% when compared to the present 5.5%. It will be almost thrice the present values. So even without accounting the black money, so in India we know how much black money is existing in the society. Even without black money, if it is 18, means imagine if all the black money is made white, how well the nation will be. So that is the point which author is arguing. So our aim is, there are 10% of rich Indians who are earning 55% of nation's income. You please tax them completely. If you are taxing them in a right way, at right proportion, then the government's revenue will be boosting. So that is what the author is arguing. So in India, there are two types of rich people. The one type of people are those who are filing tax income. Even though they are filing tax income, they are not they are not declaring their full income. So they are not declaring their full income. The second types of taxpayers, second types of rich people are the ones who are not filing at all. They are not at all filing, and they are hiding. Okay, even though they are paying, they are not declaring their full income. So second type of people are not filing at all. They are not at all declaring, and they are not at all paying the single money. So what should be the aim of the tax policy now? The aim of the tax policy is to identify these people and make them declare their full amount. To make them declare their full amount, that is to target this 55%. And the second thing is, government should identify these people and they should make them file returns. If they are identifying these people and make them declare more, and identify these people to file returns and pay tax, if these two are done, we can fully exploit the potential of this 55% of income. Only if this just 55% of income is taxed, then government's revenue problems, everything will be solved. So that should be the aim of the tax policy. That is to make the former declare more and make the latter to file the returns. Fourth, ever since the 2014, our government has taken a lot of steps with respect to boost the tax collection. Like for example, they brought in this demonetization to bring in a lot of black money into the economy's net and to tax a lot of people. Government said that a lot of people have filed the tax return, but this 5.5% of the tax to GDP ratio is stagnant. There is no improvement. So government did this demonetization. In 2014, the government set up a special investigation team to bring back the black money, and they also renegotiated the treaty with respect to Mauritius. That is the double taxation avoidance treaty with respect to Mauritius, based on which only the people are evading taxes. And government also brought in many reforms with respect to converting the tax payment online, e-filing, or linking the PAN card with the Aadhaar card and all those things. Even though they are bringing a lot of reforms and nothing is being working. Recently, government at last brought this Vivad Se Viswas scheme. This Vivad Se Viswas scheme aimed at closing all the tax litigation between the government and the taxpayers. Even after Vivad Se Viswas also, there is no improvement and it is not picking up, and COVID-19 has came and stopped and blocked everything. So government's techniques are not working, and recently government has implemented a new thing in the past 1 year, that is faceless, painless and seamless system. Why government has brought in this? Because at the one side taxpayers are not paying fully, on the other side the tax collection department, that is the income tax department, is alleged to be corrupt. So if, since it is there is some corruption in the income tax department and the taxpayers are not paying well, and they are also complaining that the people who are working in income tax department are targeting the taxpayers, and hence there should be a faceless mechanism, that is the income tax department should not know who is filing the return. They should just see the return and they should see the documents and they should take a decision without identifying the individual. So they have brought in a new computer system which will be totally keep the taxpayer anonymous. Just their returns will go to the income tax officer, and based on that document they will be scrutinizing it and they will be assessing the returns filed. This system has been brought in order to improve the tax collection and in order to reduce the corruption, but still the corrupt officials are finding loopholes with respect to this system also to evade that transparency and to bring in the corruption. And another important problem with respect to the IRS department, that is the income tax department, is that it is understaffed. A few thousands IRS officers are working for collecting taxes from lakhs and lakhs of people. So this is highly understaffed, and there is also this collusive corruption. Collusive corruption means there are two types of corruption. One is coercive, another is collusive. In coercive collection, this government official will force this public to give the bribe. In collusive corruption, both the government official and public will come together and they will do the corruption together. So that is called as collusive corruption, and this kind of collusive corruption is existing in the income tax department. That is also creating a huge problem with respect to the India's tax collection figures. With all this problem, what now government should do? So even after this many reforms, no reform is working and the tax collection is stagnant for years. Because of this, who is going to be affected? The poor people are the ones who are going to be affected, because the rich people who are earning almost 55% of the nation's income, this top 10% people are just complaining the government that tax rates are very high. Tax rates are very high. Government is collecting a lot of taxes and they are complaining that even though we are paying taxes, we are not getting any development. They are just complaining, but they are not contributing. The well-off who gained the most of the country's development, they benefited all the development of the nation for the past 70 years, and that's why they are well-off. The well-off who gained the most of the country's development complain, but the poor are living with the injustice, because the reason for the tax collection is distributive justice. What is this distributive justice? I'll just explain this and wind up. That is, the government, what they should do, the government should tax the rich. Government should tax the rich people and collect the money from the rich people and spend it for the poor through the expenditure. So the rich people should be taxed more, and with that money government should spend for the poor and ensure the welfare of the nation. So this is called as distributive justice, and this is called as redistributive principle of our DPSP. In DPSP article 39B and C talks about this. We have to prevent the concentration of wealth and we have to aim at redistribution of wealth. So based on this principle, what we have to do now, we have to improve the tax collection, we have to tax the rich more and we have to spend for the poor more. So third editorial is about making agricultural market reforms successful. So this editorial is about agricultural marketing reforms and it is written by Mr. C.S.E. Shekhar, who is an economics professor at Institute of Economic Growth. So he is talking about agricultural marketing reforms. So we are having this word called in syllabus in GS paper 3 called marketing of agricultural produce under GS3 economy. So this topic is directly relevant in the syllabus. So recently Government of India brought in certain historic and phenomenal agricultural marketing reforms, like they amended the Essential Commodities Act. So this was done during the COVID pandemic in order to bring in certain phenomenal reforms. So one is they amended the Essential Commodities Act, where they deregulated the pulses, cereals, oil seeds, consumption oil, onion and potato. So they deregulated all these commodities out of the Essential Commodities Act, which means that the traders can stock this without any restrictions. Earlier they could not stock this over a particular limit. Now they can stock this without any restriction, and they have also given exemptions for the people who are doing the processing and the people who are exporting. So these are all based on the reforms given in the economic survey of 2019-20. So we discussed about this in our detailed in economic survey video. Next reform which they have done is about the APMC. So in Agricultural Product Marketing Committee, so every farmer have to sell their products only in the mandi, APMC mandi. The APMC mandi had a lot of bureaucratic and market interventionist disturbances to the farmers, and it increased the price of the goods also. Now the farmer is free to sell all those commodities to anyone in India without any restrictions. And third, they brought in this contract farming. In contract farming, where a private sector will have a contract with the farmer and they directly procure from them. So these three are going to increase the private sector investment in agriculture. So this is going to increase the private sector investments at one side. This is going to reduce the fear for the private sector for the investment. It is right increase the FDI in the agriculture sector and ultimately doubling the farmers' income. So doubling farmers' income is one of our crucial target. This is going to double the farmers' income within 2022. So all these things are going to happen. If private investment in agriculture increase, the farmers can have more profits. So that is another thing. Even though government has done all these reforms, there are still issues which needs to be addressed. So there are many issues that needs to be addressed by the government. The first problem with respect to these reforms is the time inconsistency or policy credibility problem. This problem is where the preference of the policymaker. So the preference or priority of the policymaker is changing over the period of time. It is not consistent. Initially they are bringing in a move. The move which follows that is not consistent with the move which they have brought earlier. That is, first they will bring in a reform. There is second reform which they are bringing is not consistent with the first reform. So there is an incoherence between these two. That's why it is the signals given to the investors are getting wrong here, and hence the investors are not getting any confidence to invest, because the investors are getting confused because it is giving wrong policy signals. The first, they brought ENAM initiative. So ENAM is a E-National Agricultural Market. It was aimed at integrating all the mandis under the APMC under the one government E-National Agricultural Market portal, where any farmer can sell any of its produce through this portal to anywhere in India. But in order to implement this efficiently, state government should come in, because we all know agriculture is in the state list. So state government should amend their own acts to implement it, but many states didn't do it. So that's why this wasn't a fruitful initiative. The second intervention is about the PM Asha scheme. If you take this farming sector, we can divide the farming sector into three dimensions. That is, the first thing is about the input to the farming, like seed or fertilizers or other inputs to the agriculture. And next is about the output. Output means after the cultivation, the farmer has to process it and then take it to the market here. So these are all the stages. One is the input, another is the output stage where he is ready with the produce, and third is to go and sell it in the market. So now government introduced another scheme called PM Asha. We have already discussed about this PM Asha scheme in detail in another video. So please see that video. We'll be explaining the PM Asha scheme in detail. So now ENAM scheme was aimed at integration of the market. So it was entirely targeted at this place. Now next, the PM Asha scheme is aims at the output of the farming sector. That is, they are going to do the interventions at the procurement side. So procurement is something which is coming between the market and the farming. So government comes here and they procure it directly. So it was brought in at the procurement side, where it was entirely government funded. So the first component in PM Asha was to provide the MSP. So providing the minimum support price is to assuring the farmers that the government will procure whenever there is a market failure. But announcement of so government announced this scheme only for the pulses and the oil seeds. We all know there are 25 crops which are dependent on this MSP, but it was implemented only with respect to pulses and oil seeds, and that's why it restricted the success of the scheme to a lot of other crops, where government announced that it is going to provide 50% more than whatever the money they have spent in the inputs, but it couldn't reach because of the restriction imposed by the government. So this is the first issue with respect to the PM Asha. The second thing is, the second part is price deficient payment scheme. So this price deficient payment scheme, it aims at providing the difference between the MSP announced by the government and the market price. See, if the market price falls below the MSP, government will procure at the minimum support price. So that is the logic of MSP. Now what in price deficiency payment scheme, farmer will be allowed to sell in the market and government will pay the difference between the MSP and market price. That is this price deficiency payment scheme. So, but this price deficiency scheme was implemented only in the Madhya Pradesh in the name of the Bhavatar Bhugtan Yojana, and it wasn't implemented in any other state. That's why the success of this scheme also was restricted. And the third intervention which they brought is private procurement scheme, where the private players are allowed to procure at the MSP. Farmers need not expect government to procure at MSP at every time. But that scheme also didn't work because it wasn't initiated at all. Even though they announced it under the PM Asha, they didn't initiate at all. That is another thing which led to that failure. And falling budgetary outlays over the years. So over the period of times, government initially they allocated almost 4,700 crore in 2018-19, but the allocation reduced to 321 crore. So this reduction is almost 12 times reduction. So the second year they got only 300 crore, and the third year they got only 500 crore. So which is very less allocation. So falling budgetary outlay also led to the fall of the PM Asha. So the first they brought ENAM at the market level. The second they brought PM Asha at the procurement level. So government next they brought another scheme called PM Kisan, where they decided to directly give the cash transfer and support to the farmer. So this was implemented at the input level. So here government is going to give 6,000 rupees directly to farmer to procure the inputs. So it has become an input support scheme and a direct cash transfer scheme. So if you could see here, it is shifting between the market intervention and the input intervention. So likewise it was going on, and the PM Kisan is a success, and during the COVID-19 time it was helpful to farmers because government could provide the cash transfer, because cash transfer is that silver bullet during the COVID times, and PM Kisan was helpful. But what is the reality now? Even though the PM Kisan was going, during the COVID-19 itself, government implemented another new reform. So these new reforms which are announced now are again aiming at the market. So government is just moving around between the market and the input side. So it is just shifting. So this has led to the flip-flops by the government. So now what government is doing? Government is just shifting from the market-based approach to public-funded approach. That is initially market-based, then they went to the procurement side, then they brought in a scheme for input side, again they are bringing in for market side. Likewise, government's priorities are changing every year. So government's priorities are changing every year. That is, on that year of implementation, they are focusing on it and spending a lot of money. The next year, they are shifting their focus to something else and reducing the budgetary allocation. The next year, they spent all the money in PM Kisan and they reduced the allocation for Asha. Now, in this year, they are focusing on this. In next year, again, another thing. So, this kind of flip-flops between the publicly funded scheme and a market-based scheme has given unclear public policy signals to the private investors. So, private investors are not confident enough. That is called as time inconsistency problem. This time inconsistency problem has given the wrong signals to the investors, and then they are losing their confidence. This loss of confidence has led to the wait and watch approach. So private investors are not investing. Even after announcing this many reforms, the private investors are not investing because they are not confident enough. So that is the problem of time inconsistency and policy credibility. You can note down these words. These words we can write in our answers. If you are writing such words, it will improve our answer writing. The next problem is, we all know agriculture is in the state list. So in order to successfully implement any reforms with respect to agriculture, you need the cooperation of the states. So states have to amend their own laws and they have to implement it. And hence, central should follow a consultative and conciliatory approach with the states. So there should be a good relationship between the center and state, and between the states also, because government is easing the interstate and intrastate trade now by amending the APMC Act, and they allowing the farmer to sell anywhere. Interstate and intrastate trade is going to be affected. So the state government should come and do that. So center should be able to convince the state government, but they should not be forcing them. So they should come as level down, and they should have a consultation with the state government, and they should follow a conciliatory approach instead of dominant approach. So that is what the author is suggesting. So interstate and intrastate and center state cooperation is must here. And next problem which is hampering such reforms are market failures. So whenever the market fails because of the bumper crop or because of the any climate change or uneven rains or something, farmers are already they are getting a lot of money from the money lenders with high interest rates, and they are investing. If there is a market failure, there is no proper insurance and credit access to the farmer. So there is no formal credit mechanism because of various other reasons, and insurance access is also hampered. That's why farmers are dependent on this money lenders. And there is also this huge land leasing problems. All these problems, at one side, this credit and insurance problem is making the farmers poor, and it is not allowing the farmers to develop themselves. And this land leasing problems, in India, this land leasing law is different in each state. Since the land leasing law is different in each state, the private sectors are finding it difficult to invest. That is at one side. On another side, when the land is leased, leased lands are not eligible for credit access. That is to get the farm loan. Because of all these restrictions, no one is opting for this land leasing. If this is done, then agriculture reforms would be better. So author is suggesting all these problems which are existing. So now government should bring in a consistent policy. They should not be inconsistent. They should alleviate this time inconsistency problem. There should be a consistent policy. There should be a collaborative approach. And finally, there should be complementary reforms. Government should be consistent. They should either focus one and implement that with full vigor. And there should be complementary reforms also, like land leasing reforms or credit and insurance reforms. Then only we can alleviate the problems in the agricultural marketing. So that is what the author is mentioning in this article. The fourth editorial is about the uncharted territory of outer space. So this article is written by Mr. Syed Akbaruddin, who was India's permanent representative in United Nations and former IFS officer. So we already discussed one of his articles 2 weeks back with respect to the cyberspace regulation. Now he has come back again with respect to the space regulation. Since he was a member of United Nations, he is talking about the global governance. So global governance and issues associated with that. In this article, he is talking about the governance in the area of space. So there is this word called awareness in the field of space under the science and tech in paper 3. That awareness in the field of space, we are having this editorial relevant. So the state of global governance in space and need for space legislation. So he is talking about the issues with respect to the global governance and the necessity of the space legislation in India. We need to form a special law with respect to space in India. Let us see why. So that is what he is discussing in the article. In the first 2 paragraphs of his article, he is discussing about a lot of space initiatives. So please note down those space initiatives in the first 2 paragraphs and study about that in with respect to the preliminary point of view. Because in prelims we are getting this one-line questions, and it can be a potential one-liner question. So now we'll go to the article. So he's starting this article by first quoting about the fall in prices. That is how the space sector has grown over the years. That is, there is 20 times fall in the prices with respect to a space station. Earlier you have to spend, if you want to launch a satellite, you have to spend 54,000 per dollar. So it was 54,000 dollar per kg to launch a satellite. Now it is just $2,700 a kg. So this dramatic fall has revolutionized the space, and in another decade the rate will be falling in such a level that it will be just $100. With the SpaceX and all, with the advent of SpaceX and ISRO is one of the cheapest agency with respect to the space launch. We launch space at the most affordable costs. So that's why all developing nations come to us. And he's also talking about the space market potential. So presently the space market, outer space market, and the economy behind it is of worth of $350 billion. And it is going to increase to 2.7 trillion by 2050. So 2.7 trillion is nothing but India's GDP's value. So it is going to be as equal as the Indian economy's value by 2050. So that is the potential. And you please note down these 2 facts. So these 2 are the facts. We can quote it with respect to any questions or essays with respect to the space. So these are 2 important facts which we can quote. Please note it down. And next here, this potential is being raised because of the private sector participation. Recently, SpaceX under Elon Musk announced this Starlink project, where they are going to launch 10,000 satellites in the lower Earth orbit. They have to provide the broadband connection, that is through internet connection through the satellites directly. So that is the ambitious project. And there is also another project called Project Kuiper of Amazon. So Amazon has launched this project with the same objective with 3,000 satellites. So they are planning to provide internet all over the world. So such projects are increasing the potential of the space sector, and the latest technological developments are also increasing this potential. So that is what author is mentioning. But even though the potential is so high, there are several challenges with respect to the space sector. First is, these challenges are with respect to the global governance only. The first problem is multilateral arrangements are becoming obsolete. So there are many international multilateral treaties with respect to space, such as Outer Space Treaty of 1967, or Rescue Agreement, or Space Liability Convention, or Space Registration Convention, or the Moon Treaty of 1979. So even though we are having these many treaties with respect to the outer space, all these treaties are becoming obsolete. Obsolete means it is not being suitable for the modern era, because they were all launched in the bygone era of 70s and 80s. In that era, these treaties were signed, and now the entire technology is different, the entire space field is different, and that's why these treaties are not applicable now. And there is no dispute settlement mechanism within the treaty if there is any problem with respect to the outer space, and it is also having no provision with respect to the responsible destruction of space debris. So because of this increasing satellite mission, there is a huge chunk of space debris in the space, in the lower Earth orbit. So this increasing space debris can lead to Kessler syndrome. So see, what is this Kessler syndrome? It was also shown in the movie called Gravity. So there is such a huge stress because of the space debris, but there is no treaty which is talking about the space debris. So that is one of the important problem, and it is not suitable for the modern day. The second problem is the legal framework. So the entire legal framework with respect to space is only state centric. That is only the government of the nations are responsible. But over the period of times after this 2010, a lot of private players started to participate. Now SpaceX is one of the dominant player in the space field, but there is no provision to regulate the private sectors. So that is one of the huge problem. And also there has been talk, even though even Donald Trump talked about this resource recovery program. The space resource recovery means government, these nations will go to some other planet and they will be mining the resources there and bringing back to Earth, like they were showing in the movie called Avatar, where they will be mining from another planet. So likewise the space recovery program also they are talking, where they are also talked about planning to mine this asteroid called 16 Psyche. So this 16 Psyche is having heavy metals of worth 10,000 quadrillion. 10,000 quadrillion means 10,000 followed by 15 zeros. So that much worth of resources are there, so they are aiming it. But this space resource recovery program is again against the spirit of the various space statutes, which said that we will not extract any. So space is belonging to entire humanity, and no single nation can claim the ownership. So that is actually the spirit of space statutes. But if we are bringing in the space recovery program and all, that will be against this spirit. And next, militarization of the space. Over the period of time, a lot of space related arms are being developed, anti-satellite missiles are being developed. Even India tested an anti-satellite missile. So India became the fourth nation to have an anti-satellite missile, along with USA, China and Russia. So these kind of anti-satellite missile and militarization of space, and there is also a this space arms race is going on, which can be a huge threat again. Because why this militarization is happening? Because entire nation nowadays, the entire economy of the nation or the entire functioning of the army is also using a lot of different satellites. So such satellites are increasing the dependability of the Indian army and defense sector of the nation, or the entire economy of the nation, on the satellite. If one satellite is destroyed, the entire economy will be destroyed. So that is the risk with respect to this space race. So, and there is no progress in addressing it, even though there were a lot of treaties which was discussed, like the United Nations General Assembly passed the resolution in 1982 to prevent the arms race in the outer space, but that treaty, that resolution never worked, it never picked up. And there are many other interventions. Even the European Union decided to bring a code of conduct for the outer space. That is also not gaining any traction. That is also stagnant. So nothing is working, no progress is working, and all the nations are just increasing the space arms. So that is the problem now. India is also turning ambitious now. So India is planning to launch a manned space mission. We are going to launch a solar observatory called Aditya mission. Then we are planning for a Venus mission. So India also is planning to have its own space station by 2030. So such ambition of India is bringing India in as a dominant player in the space field, and that leads to a necessity of a separate space legislation. India brought in this in-space initiative to address this problem, because this InSpace is a body which is being created as a regulator and a facilitator. It is going to act as an interface between the ISRO and the private sectors, and it is going to regulate the private sector with respect to the space. So now if you could see in space sector, earlier there are only ISRO, so only government was there, so no need of a regulator. Now since there are private entities also are there, we need an independent regulator to regulate both the private and the government. So such a regulator is InSpace, which is being created now. So that will address this legal framework issue, which will address the regulation of private sector. So that is a welcome move. Likewise, India should bring in a space legislation. That is what the author is finally concluding. So at this time, whatever challenges are existing, India should at least try to bring in certain space legislation within their own nation. They should regulate the space with coherence, which is coherence across the technical, legal, commercial and diplomatic and defense goals of the nation, with the global governance, regulatory atmosphere and arms control in mind. So all these issues should be put forward, and coherent space legislation should be brought, which is going to regulate our Indian space sector, so that we can become a ambitious space nation. So that is what the author is suggesting. And with respect to international governance, if they are asking any questions, we can address all these points and write an answer. We can tell that if these points are clarified, then we can easily bring in a global governance model. So the final article for the day is about the global university ranking and Indian universities. For a change, I have picked this article from Indian Express. So this article is an editorial from Indian Express. I liked this editorial because it was a potential mains question and it was interesting. So I decided to bring in this editorial from Indian Express. We used to discuss only Hindu, but now we are just discussing one from Express for today. So there is this topic in syllabus in GS2 called issues related to education. So in GS2, issues related to education health is part of the social sector services topic. So it is directly related to syllabus, and there can also be a potential question. So there can be this question: even though India is having certain phenomenal universities, it is not getting into the top 100 of global rankings. So there is no institute in the top 100 of global rankings. Why Indian universities are not going into the top 100 of the ranking? So that is a question. This can be a potential mains question also. For that question only, this author has given a different perspective in his article. The author is none other than Jagdish Kumar, who is the Vice Chancellor of JNU, Jawaharlal Nehru University of New Delhi. So he is talking about why Indian university, even though they are highly qualitative, they are not going into the top 100 ranking of global institutions. So let us go into the article. So since universities are complex organizations with multiple objectives, comparing universities on single numerical value is ineffectual. So what he is telling, just bringing in one common standard and bringing in one common index to rank the universities and to give ranking is not a good thing. It is ineffectual. So you cannot gauge universities in India with the common characteristics, because there are many different universities. There are universities with respect to science, there are universities with respect to humanities, there are medical universities. So it is like comparing a civil engineer with a biologist or a linguistic or a dancer. So all these four people are different one, you cannot compare them. So each one should have their own index to compare their career. So likewise, each university should have its own index, and you cannot have a single index to compare. So that is what the ultimate theme of this article is. So one problem about this ranking is that this ranking, even though it is not relevant much, it is having a potential to create an elitism. If at all a few top universities in India, by spending a lot of money they have, if at all they enter the top 100, means what will happen? Let us take this example of 5 Indian universities are entering the top 100, and other universities are not entering, which means that these universities will get a tag of elitism. So elitism means they will be considered to be superior, and they will be seen above, and all the other universities will be stigmatized because of not coming into the top 100, and they will be not seen as something great, even though they are having the potential. So that is the risk. So there is a danger of creating certain elite universities. These 5 universities will be considered as the best in the nation, and all the others will not be considered the best, even though they are having the same capabilities. Just because they had additional funding and additional capital from the government support, they spent that and they went into the ranking. The rankings will have many criteria. By spending money, this university can fit into this criteria and enter into the top 100. But there might be same university which is providing similar university which is providing quality education, but lack of funding might stop it. So that will lead to elite status to this university and stigmatize this university. So that is a major problem with respect to the such kind of ranking. So that must be avoided. International rankings are also forcing universities. They are telling that only if you follow these criteria, you will be given the ranking. So such kind of criteria they are having. So these kind of criteria might not be relevant for India. So in India, the way of education might be different. The way of people, how they grew up might be different. And at the same time, the role of the university will be different. A university which is functioning at the best might follow some other techniques. At the end of the day, what you have to see, what is the quality of education of the students, that we have to check. What is the level of placement the students are getting, and what is the level of research the students are making. So such kind of things only have to do. But having in the standard criteria for the entire world, that is top down approach. So top down approach or one size fit all approach will not be suitable for universities. So that is the thing. So and they are also forcing the universities to alter their core mission. For example, with respect to JNU, when JNU applied for the international ranking, they asked JNU to increase the number of courses they are offering. So JNU just offers the courses in the humanities. So they are not generally offering courses with respect to the sciences, and they are focusing only on the humanities, and at the same time they are more research oriented, but they are forcing them to provide a lot of undergraduate courses in the various fields. Then only they can provide the ranking. So that cannot be. They cannot force what we have to do. They have to just gauge the courses which are given in JNU, and they cannot ask the JNU to start new courses. So that is the problem now. The second issue is the perception. So in the international ranking, there is this one parameter called perception. Whenever the universities are ranked in the international level, they are having this perception as one of the parameter, which is having almost 50% of the weightage. The meaning of the word perception means what another people is thinking about you, or what is the thing they are perceiving about you. So what they are thinking. So any people can think about anyone in any way. Like for example, perception can be a result of different stimuli based on the knowledge of the person, memory of the person, or like for example, there is this JNU as a college, and there is this Jamia Millia, and there is Banaras Hindu University. So there are 3 colleges now. There is Benares Hindu University, there is Jamia Millia College, and there is JNU. So each individual, based on their own knowledge and their own memory, they can have different perception. For some, JNU might be best college. For some, Jamia will be the best college, and JNU might not be best college. For some, Benares Hindu University will be the best. So likewise, the perception vary from people to people based on their own criteria, and that cannot be used as a parameter for ranking. But these international institutions are using this perception parameter. That is, they are asking the students and they are asking the people what they think about the university, and they are making this as a criteria for ranking them. So that is becoming a futile thing. This is the next thing. So the perception weightage must be reduced. Next, they are also using this citations as a primary indicator of productivity. Citations means number of research paper launched. These citations and research papers launched by a university will be higher with respect to science background only. The science or technology oriented courses only will be publishing a lot of citations and papers. Humanities based universities might not have that many citations. Even though they might be providing good education, they might not be having such many citations as when compared to the science background universities. But having citations as a factor will give a bias towards the science based ranking. If you could see in the top 500 of the global rankings, most of the universities are from science only, and there are very less from humanities. Having citation as one of the criteria is the major reasons. And next, because of even though a lot of nations have highlighted this, international ranking organizations are too rigid with their methodologies. They are not willing to either add any other additional parameters or change their weightage. People are asking to reduce this perception weightage, they are not listening. People are talking about these criticisms, they are not correcting it. Then they are very rigid with respect to their approach. So that is another problem with them. And that's why more than 70 countries, because of this inelastic stance, more than 70 countries have stopped focusing on this global ranking, and they started to have their own national ranking systems. So they decided to bring in their own national ranking system based on their own parameters. So likewise, Government of India also launched its own national ranking system. So that is called as National Institutional Ranking Framework, NIRF. It was launched in 2016 by Ministry of HRD. This NIRF ranking is being now given every year. Every year, all the universities in the India are being ranked, and the rank is being released. This rank is entirely based on our own criteria, our own parameters, whichever we thought, and this is what the author is telling. We should follow this. This should be the ultimate ranking framework where the universities to focus to get the top ranks instead of going in for the global rankings, which is not needed. So that is what the author is talking. Because the parameters used this are very pragmatic: teaching, learning and resources, research and professional practice, graduation outcomes, outreach and inclusivity. So they are having this parameter called inclusivity, how inclusive it is, bringing in all the people from the vulnerable sections or the women or the disabled and all those things. So, and peer perception, even there is this parameter for also perception, but the perception is given weightage of only 10%, but in international level it is being given 50%, which is creating the problem. These parameters are also universally acceptable, and they are given in 4 different categories. It is not like that one ranking for all the universities. It is not one size fit all approach. They are having 4 different indices and ranking for 4. There is a separate ranking for universities, there is a separate ranking for colleges which are providing engineering, separate ranking for management and pharmacy colleges, and this year they have also launched a separate ranking for medical colleges, law colleges and architectural college and dental college. So all this, see, there is a separate thing for MBBS and there is a separate thing for dental. When these colleges are ranked with a separate index, then only it will be effective, and NIRF is doing that. What now Indian institutions should do? Indian institutions should focus on this ranking framework, and they should aim at getting the top rank in this ranking framework. This ranking framework will sure bring in healthy competition in Indian universities, and that will lead to the ultimate transformation of Indian universities as world-class institutions. So don't go for global university rankings. Focus on the Indian rankings, which is brought by the Ministry of HRD, that is National Institutional Ranking Framework. Thank you guys. I have an important announcement for you all. So this is going to be the last video for this season. We are going to take a preliminary break. So since there is only 1 month left for the preliminary examination, so we are going to take for a month now, and we will be continuing these 5 editorials of the week from October. So it is just going to be a 4-week break. So till then, what you have to do, you have to identify all the 30 editorials which we have discussed, and there are totally 150 points which we have discussed. So now with these 6 videos, we are having 150 points for the mains examinations. You just revise all these 150 points in this 1 month, and we will be continuing it in the first week of October. So till then, it is Adil Beg signing off, and all the best for your preliminary examinations.